This is Politics and Media 101. I'm Jeff Browning. Dr. Kathleen McInnis is Senior Fellow and Director of the Smart Women, Smart Power Initiative at CSIS. Dr. McInnis is an incredibly accomplished national security professional. Among her roles, she served as an expert advisor to the U.S. Congress, the U.S. Secretary of Defense, and the UK Parliament on topics like NATO operations, nuclear weapons strategy, and transatlantic relations. These are complicated issues that, even for the world's top experts, take a lot of collaboration and focus to solve. For many years, the national security field has been dominated by men. But history has also shown us that when you exclude half of the population from any political or decision-making process, it weakens the result. Our co-founders Justin Higgins and John Gunnison spoke with Dr. McInnis about her own years of experience working at the highest levels of national security and why these issues are critical to winning the future. For more information, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode. Without any further ado, let's roll the tape.
Kathleen, I listened to your inaugural podcast episode over there at Smart Women, Smart Power, and I heard you mention that you grew up a little bit around the world. I think your father was in the military, and so you went to school in different parts of the world. And I actually had a very similar experience. I was one of those embassy kids living for a couple years in Abu Dhabi when my father worked at the U.S. Embassy over there. So,
oh, wow, yeah.
I was curious which locations you were in when you were bouncing around the globe as a kid growing up.
My dad was a National Security Agency guy. There was a post in the UK that we just sort of went back and forth from. So I was there in the 80s as a kid, and then in the 90s as a high school student and through a bit of college. And then I did my master's and my PhD over there. So I've spent a ridiculously long amount of time in the UK, as it happens.
Yeah, I saw that you got your master's and PhD from LSE and from King's College. And I saw you must be an Anglophile. And today we're recording this. All of the news is about number 10 Downing Street and the House of Commons and how Boris Johnson might soon be losing his job as a prime minister. I'm sure you must have been following that very closely and have a lot of thoughts on this goings on.
Not so many thoughts right now, just sort of like disbelief. I mean, it's just wild what's happening over there with so many resignations all at once. And Boris Johnson's been a contentious leader for quite some time. But even so, this is quite extraordinary.
Well, I suppose that one thing that the UK government have been complimented on recently has been their defense policy. Ben Wallace, the defense secretary over there, has been receiving a lot of compliments for the way that he's approached the war in Ukraine. Do you generally find that they've been able to successfully silo out their national security and defense policy from all of these other disastrous and sort of humorous political machinations?
I think over time, the UK, I think that's just generally true across different governments. The UK's defense policy tends to be pretty shrewd, resource constrained, surely. And that's the big challenge that it always faces. And also the extent to which its ambitions can meet the resources constraints that it has. And then the other thing that is a constant issue in UK defense policy is its alliance relationships, which is profoundly changed after Brexit, right? One of the key reasons that the special relationship was so important to the US is because it was a solid ally within NATO, but also a like mind within the European Union framework.
Well, Kathleen, one of the topics that we wanted to focus on in this conversation was about women in positions of national security decision-making power. And it's funny, we're talking about Boris Johnson because a comment that he made very recently is actually a pretty good jumping off point here. He said in a recent interview that if Vladimir Putin were a woman, he would not have invaded Ukraine. And this was immediately lampooned. People pointed to Catherine the Great and Indira Gandhi. But I do wonder if this could be a conversation starter, if we could take a look at that comment, however exaggerated it might have been, and ask the question of whether we have found any real differences in the way that women and men approach matters of war and peace when they're in those positions of authority.
You know, I think you're exactly right that his comment was an interesting conversation starter, at least as I viewed it. And especially, Margaret Thatcher was also a pretty hardcore woman that took the UK into the Falklands. So is it fair to say that his gender would have prevented him from going to war in Ukraine? That might be a bit of a stretch, but I don't think it's a stretch to make the argument that the machismo, what we would call toxic masculinity as a feature of the Putin regime, is manifesting in all sorts of pernicious ways that, at least in the national security world, I would argue that we aren't paying nearly enough attention to. So I'm a card-carrying national security dork by trade, right? As you mentioned, I grew up on military bases in the UK overseas. I was one of those weirdos that knew in undergrad that I wanted to get involved in security studies. There's not many undergrads know, or at least not in the late 90s, that was a thing. I've known that this is my area that I wanted to focus on for my entire career. And I liked focusing on NATO, adversary capabilities, war. I was a director for NATO's operations in Afghanistan in the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Going to Afghanistan, counterinsurgency, stability operations, all those things. But gender was never part of that. Gender was never a part of the conversations that I would have. To the extent it was raised or discussed, it would be the women, peace, and security initiatives, which are critically important. But it was circa 2016 that I started to realize that, hang on a second, what are we missing by not treating gender seriously as we think through the national security problems and the political problems that we have, and the issues that we face? What does gender reveal to us that we aren't getting because we're so focused on, again, like what bombs and tanks and guns the adversary has, or what's the defense spending, and having these traditional discourses? It seems to me, going back to Boris Johnson's point, it's hard to fully appreciate the different rat lines of disinformation that the Putin regime has been employing in the US and NATO publics without understanding the misogynistic undertones. It's hard to understand the discourses that are happening on the internet right now and incels and all that stuff without really thinking about gender. To what extent was this toxic masculinity a component of the toxic witch's brew that led people to January 6th? These are questions that are underexplored, because myself included until, relatively recently, we'd rather talk about literally anything else than gender, but we're missing out in so doing. So the analysis has led me to a different place. And so when the Smart Women, Smart Power gig came up, I was like, yes, it's time. It is time to lead this forward.
I think John and I both graduated in 2013, and I went to Tufts University, so very liberal school, inclusive. Now I go into work. I'm 33, 8 or 9 years out of college, and I talk to these young kids that are Gen Z, and it's like night and day. Like, my generation was brought up on a path. These folks are just so much further down that path to inclusiveness. So I have to follow up here. Aside from toxic masculinity and obviously gender equality being one of the best ways to break that down, what are the other benefits of having a more gender equality in our specifically national security leadership positions? So civil folks at the Pentagon and people that are actually doing the day-to-day making decisions, not necessarily your appointeds.
So there's a lot of really interesting data out there that suggests that when you improve gender equity in decision-making spaces, you get to better business and outcomes, right? Better decision outcomes. And the theory of the case being that by having more diverse viewpoints in the room, by having diverse perspectives that are brought to bear on a problem, that inherently as part of the discussions, you're going to get to more thorough analyses, more robust comprehensions of risks, and therefore better strategy and decision making. In the private sector, we have profit margins against which to judge that. In the public space, no such profit margin exists. And so therein lies an analytic conundrum. How do we gauge the effectiveness of gender equity in these decision-making spaces. And so I've got my podcast is about that exactly. Like, let's build the data. Let's interview people and figure out what we're actually getting by adding women to these decision-making spaces. So, check out the Smart Women, Smart Power podcast, TM, and shameless plug here. But more broadly, I think it's also important to recognize that when we're talking about these issues, it's not just a matter of, in my view, adding women, like just sprinkle women or gender dust into this calculation, and all of a sudden we get to better. We have to change the organizational cultures of national security in order to get to the kinds of outcomes we want to see. Gender equity is an input that can help you get to that more inclusive culture that we want to see. But now's, in my view, the real hard work begins. The Biden administration has done an admirable job recruiting women into all levels of the national security enterprise. And it's fantastic stuff. Okay, now what? What is this getting us? Can we use this moment to build the kind of inclusive national security culture we need to see? The whole purpose of all of this, right, is that these massive bureaucracies and institutions, their purpose is to formulate the best policy options for our senior decision makers. And it strikes me that you cannot formulate those best options if you are not able to be your full self. If you're constantly trying to be someone else or something else, or if the bureaucratic structures just don't enable that kind of creative thinking. And, in a place like the Pentagon, it's got organizational cultural characteristics that hierarchical, masculine for obvious reasons, it's derived from the military services. And in my experience of the Pentagon, which I wrote a novel on, in case that's of interest, when confronting a problem, when challenged by circumstances within or without from the government, your available emotional toolkit to process that was to either get angry, laugh, drink, and somebody added smoking a cigar. You could possibly do all of this at once. I'm a crier, right? Like, the stakes are like, it's a physiological response that I can't control. I will never forget the dude who told me that I needed to dial it down because my passion and my emotion in these issues was undermining my credibility. That shut me up, and I'm not the only one. How can we build the inclusive culture that we need to see? How do we make these steps enduring? That's the project now, and it's so exciting that we're here and able to do this.
So, Kathleen, what you've just said reminds me very much of an article published by you in Foreign Policy magazine back in October, where you and a co-author were describing a retrograde organizational and management approach across the Pentagon. And it seems as though the matter of gender equity is a crucial aspect of this very broad problem, in which the Pentagon doesn't really operate like a modern company that you would see in the private sector. Not that we should be running our government like a business. That's another fallacy that we can talk about some other time.
Oh, absolutely.
However, we could, in part, implement some key learnings from contemporary management theories. We could upgrade the technology that's used internally inside of our agencies and bureaucratic institutions. Kathleen, can you describe how big of a problem this is across the way that the Pentagon functions, and maybe give an example of how it's visibly affected outcomes in national security decision-making that people in the audience might recognize?
The answer is yes. Is the Pentagon organizationally retrograde? Again, as you mentioned, that foreign policy article, yes. And at the center of that piece are making the case that the institution, the bureaucracy, isn't setting up its people for success. Bureaucracies, governments, war, peace, these are human institutions and human endeavors. And we somehow have missed the human in all of us. We somehow treat our civil servants and even the politicals as these sort of interchangeable widgets. And that is unacceptable. Over the past 15 years, the civil service in the Pentagon, at least in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, has lost enormous amounts of its brainpower and human capital because people are leaving. Sequestrations, furloughs, and frankly, disempowering organizational structures. You gotta, to get a memo to the Secretary of Defense, you gotta clear horizontally, usually 5 or 6 different offices, and vertically, that's 7 offices, usually from an action officer to the SecDef. It's enormously cumbersome, and people tend to get beaten down in the process. And, after a while, your fund meter's pegged. One friend of mine went and decided to run a dispensary. Another is a real estate agent. I mean, we're not talking about leaving leaving the Pentagon and doing something. We're talking about fundamentally different career paths because of the kind of burnout that we're seeing. And actually, I ended up testifying in advance of Secretary Austin's confirmation and the Senate Armed Services Committee last year. And the key point was that the civil service these institutions are arguably on life support because because of the personnel attrition. And we haven't cared for these institutions and these people for a long time. We've taken it for granted, and we have to stop. We can't think our way through these big things like strategic competition unless we've got the best people on the case, and they need to be there for the long term, right? And we're not prioritizing that deep subject matter expertise. One more anecdote, if I may, and then I'll stop. A friend of a friend told me this, but it resonates pretty deeply. That Secretary Mattis got into office, and he asked for a brief on Pakistan. And the desk officer came to do the brief on Pakistan, and the secretary said, "Well, how long have you been on that desk?" And the desk officer said 6 months. And immediately the secretary dismissed him and dismissed the Office of the Secretary of Defense and its advice, because he was like, 6 months, that's barely enough time to learn to chew gum, much less understand enough about Pakistan in order for me to make effective decisions or for me to trust your recommendations. Back in the late 90s, there was a decision made to prioritize general expertise in the civil service in the Pentagon. So you needed to be able to understand how the Pentagon works in order to become in the senior executive service, which is like the civil service equivalent of being a general or an admiral. So you had to be have this general expertise, and you needed to be able to bounce around between different offices every couple of years. And in so doing, sort of eviscerated the institution's deep expertise on different subject matters, and unintentionally, but that's what happened. And so sometimes you sort of look at some of these policies and you're like, really, this seems pretty disconnected from reality or whatever. And well, it's just people doing their best under ridiculous circumstances and not necessarily being prepared for success. That is a dynamic that I think we need to change. And getting back to the point of this discussion, I think gender is a pretty cool and useful way to do so.
The paradigm is often depicted by Spear and Spindle. The Spear, designating men, says that they will protect the home, provide for the family, and they'll take care of those things in the community and the state, while the women with their spindles are protected in the home to care for the family. There's always been a thread of fallacy to that paradigm, but since the end of the Cold War, it's been shown just plain wrong. The United Nations tells us that when women are involved in conflict resolution and writing the treaties that end the conflicts, that the chances of that treaty lasting 15 years or more goes up by 35%. That's because the nature of war has changed. But words are easier than actions. Sometimes action or inaction is simply a function of individuals not being aware that either there is a challenge or a potential path to addressing the challenge. The problem is we tend to see these issues, these events, as idiosyncratic, isolated from each other, rather than being part of a larger power structure that connects the dots. But we've got to connect those dots if we're ever going to move past this outdated paradigm that says women are excluded from security.
Kathleen, that problem that you mentioned about people skipping around from different offices and different desks instead of building a lot of experience in their current job. It made me think about a choice that we make in the way that we staff our embassies and the way that our diplomatic corps is organized, where we rotate the staff at embassies very often as a clear conscious decision because we don't want people to be too entrenched or get too close to the host country. So the ambassador, but also a lot of the other key staff at the embassy will only stay at post for a couple of years and then move on to the next post. And, you can see some benefits to this because we are preventing the problem that I just referenced where too close a relationship is built with the host country. But at the same time, we're not getting the benefit that some other countries have where their ambassadors and their diplomatic staff really build deep, deep, deep relationships with the host country. I mean, we've seen ambassadors like the one that I'm thinking of, Yusuf El-Otaiba, the ambassador from the UAE, who's been in the United States for a decade and a half and has built such close relationships with so many of the key decision makers in Washington. And we've chosen not to do that. And you can see the trade-offs in these different approaches. I mean, just like you've said, general expertise versus specific, someone who might be in one office for such a long time, maybe they're getting a little bit entrenched in their thinking. There's always a trade-off here, but we're seeing some of what we're losing by moving our personnel around so quickly.
Right. It's always a balance, right? I tend to believe that we have gone on the wrong side of that balance. As I think it was Admiral Stavridis when he was at UCOM would say, you can't surge trust overnight. It takes time to build these relationships. It takes time to build that trust and that credibility. And you never know when you're going to need it. The reason we were able to pull off operations in Afghanistan so quickly, and it was shortly after the September 11th attacks, is because of the solid diplomatic relationships we had in Central Asia. And we could surge the posture and presence forward. What are we missing by viewing our people as interchangeable widgets, right? My central argument is that we're humans. Let's start looking at the national security puzzle and our national security institutions as human ones.
Secretary Austin has had to deal with a lot since coming into office, right? The withdrawal of Afghanistan, Ukraine, which is, I can imagine, a logistical nightmare that only the U.S. is equipped to support. And I'm sure there's so many other things that don't make the news, never mind the rebalancing to Asia. And we could go on, and this is a whole nother discussion. But you mentioned a retrograde organizational hierarchy and structure and how we view people. You mentioned a symptom of that is the death of expertise almost in certain areas. Since Secretary Austin has taken over leadership of the Pentagon, have you seen any efforts to address these problems in a way that we might view as being sufficient?
Secretary Austin seems very well attenuated to these problems, which is very encouraging. The prior secretaries did not take the health of the organization as seriously as he is. And also Kath Hicks, who is a deep subject matter expert on all things Department of Defense. She is really driving this train forward in some positive directions. But, one other thing that Secretary Austin said during his confirmation hearing, and I think it resonates across this issue as well, is he was speaking with respect to racism in the ranks. And he said, when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, you can't ever take your hand off the wheel, right? There's no destination. Society evolves, institutions evolve, people evolve. And as a result, the calculation always has to change. We have to continue to prioritize it. I think the same is true with gender, and I think the same is true with the overall organizational culture. Things that I would like to see out of the Pentagon, and I'm hoping that they're working on this, are things like, what's the continuity? How do we take these gains and these insights on how we can do better and institutionalize them, not just in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, but in the military departments, in the Joint Staff, and across the force? How can we redesign an organizational culture that is meaningfully inclusive, where all members of the team can really feel like they can contribute, as opposed to having to conform or get out? It is a delicate balance, right? Military service members wear uniforms for a reason, right? Uniformity is in some ways an important priority. But as we're recognizing the challenges that we're facing strategically and some of their manifestations tactically and operationally, we need to have all of the team enabled to bring their best selves to whatever decision-making spaces they are part of. And Secretary Austin is doing some admirable work trying to build that space and build that culture. But there's a long way to go.
Yeah, and it seems like something that we're always going to be having to work on as society and culture evolves. But just to follow up there, you've worked US, UK, NATO. We're talking about the US system, which could greatly improve. But when we compare, let's do a little comparative politics for our audience here. When we compare and contrast what we have going on at the Pentagon to some of the other places you've either worked with, studied, how do we compare? Are we way behind? Are we kind of at peer level? Maybe we're better than others. How do you kind of analyze where we're at?
In some ways, it's an apples to oranges comparison, right? Because of the different political and organizational structures that different countries have and that individuals have to navigate. I was doing a book talk in Denmark, and what was pointed out to me, not just by the women in the audience, but also men in government institutions and in academia at the time, they were like, so on paper, we have a great track record brief on our gender equity and that equal opportunity is the law, and therefore we're looking great, especially compared to you guys. However, because there is these legal codes that specify what gender equality means and conforming with that, it becomes a box checking exercise for a lot of businesses and institutions. And so rather than actually thinking about how women can better be integrated into the workforce and how to harness their amazing power and talent, it becomes, oh, no, we've satisfied these criteria. Therefore, no, gender equity is not a problem. Again, it's this box ticking exercise, and it misses the point. And I was really struck by that assertion. And so when I think about the US conversation, I am in some ways dismayed, right? Because there is so much work to be done. And, pushback on gender equity in these decision-making spaces is already happening, right? There's accusations of tokenism. There's accusations of affirmative action. These women got these roles in the Biden administration because they're women, not because they're powerful, qualified experts in their own right. They got it because they're women. That kind of pushback. So that is disheartening. And it's another reason why I've designed my podcast the way I have, like to build the data set to understand what gender gets us in these decision-making spaces. So we've got a lot of work to do there. But on the flip side, we can have these conversations in a much more honest and authentic way than I think a lot of spaces in our allies, at least as I perceive them, are able to have. And how do we get things done in this country? We talk a lot. We have these discourses, and sometimes it's endlessly frustrating. But we recognize that we're recognizing that this is a problem that has to be tackled. We're taking steps to do it, and there's a lot more work to do. But it's encouraging that we can do it.
How do we prevent from falling into that trap of just checking boxes? Because I'm coming at it from the perspective of, we had Mitt Romney and his binder full of women, which not the best way to phrase it. Maybe it got blown out of proportion a lot by the media if we look at what Donald Trump was saying after him as a GOP nominee. And then with WikiLeaks, we have John Podesta sending emails where Obama literally had binders full of women, people of color, for specific offices that he was going to appoint. And it was all in the goal of going through and improving equity. So how do we strike that balance between having these boxes where we need to fit a certain amount of diversity into these institutions versus trying to organically create a culture that naturally fosters this type of stuff? Is there a way to move away from the box ticking, or do we need to rely on that and then just always try and be cognizant of not going overboard with it?
That is a fabulous question. We need to start with, this is going to sound airy-fairy, but we need to start with empathy, right? We need to actually think about our structures and our systems and our personnel management with the human at the center of it. One of the jokes I make in my novel, and I make this joke for a reason. My novel is called The Heart of War, Misadventures in the Pentagon. It's basically like The Devil Wears Prada set in the Pentagon. And one of the jokes I make is that the last person to know about a change in their career is the person actually directly affected, because we're treating people as interchangeable widgets. And we fall back on the personnel structures and policies and recruiting structures. And, you got to go through USA Jobs, and it's this like mega nightmare to actually hire somebody. On that, I would point people to Lauren DeJong Schulman's work over at the Partnership for Public Service. She is pushing this agenda hard, like how to actually redesign our bureaucratic institutions and personnel policies within existing legal frameworks. And she's also thinking about ways that hiring authorities need to be changed by Congress. So I highly recommend her work. She's of the view that I am, right? Like, the most important pressing national security issue that we face, in my view, is the national security workforce and are people empowered within it. China, Russia, yes, they're hard. These are complex challenges. But if we don't have the people empowered to be able to analyze this stuff and come up with good solutions, we're just going to be spinning our wheels again and again and again. The thing that we have to do now is move ourselves away, not away from, but building on representation, right? The conversation on equity in national security and gender in national security is largely about inputs, right? It's about, are women in these decision-making spaces, or are they part of the public conversations in meaningful ways, right? The whole Mantle thing. Okay. But the next phase is, okay, what does this get us? What does it mean to move the conversation beyond representation? And I think if we can do that, and I'm hoping 1,000 flowers bloom on this because it's so much work to do. If we can start pushing that and help communicate that and understand those dynamics, not just from a gendered perspective, but men are affected by toxic masculinity too, and perverse organizational cultural norms too, right? How do we build this for all of us? I think that's the next phase, and I think that's how we start seeing meaningful, irreversible change.
The Secret Service released a study on the growing terrorism threat of the so-called incel movement. Incel is short for involuntarily celibate. Adherents call themselves anti-feminist. The report says followers of the incel movement blame acts of violence on an inability to form relationships with women.
One example, Elaine, this week, a disturbing TikTok trend has boys and men joking about killing their romantic dates. We found dozens of eerie videos set to pop music, some on accounts with tens of thousands of dedicated views.
Since 2014, attacks inspired by the incel movement have left dozens dead in the U.S. and Canada. What did the report reveal about the common thread among followers of this ideology?
The 26-page report by Secret Service took a deep dive into red flags predating a massacre at a hot yoga studio in Tallahassee, Florida that left 2 people dead, 4 injured back in 2018. On the day of the shooting itself, he wrote in a final note that read in part, "If I can't find one decent female to live with, I will find many indecent females to die with."
So, Kathleen, I kind of want to take this opportunity then, because you just referenced how men are affected by problems of toxic masculinity. I kind of want to return to something that we referenced a little bit earlier in the conversation, and that's how misogyny or toxic masculinity in and of itself is, in fact, a security threat. Kathleen, you were talking about how we've observed that antisocial, misogynistic behaviors have often led to young men in particular taking on violent acts against the state, against society, how it's been a recruitment tool into terror cells, domestic terror cells, and also international ones. For me, this is a topic that I'm quite passionate about because my family member was a victim of the September 11th attacks. And I've observed that, especially after living in the Middle East for 8 years, that this profile of a person who's attracted to a group like Daesh or Al Qaeda tends to be very similar to the type of person who becomes a school shooter in the United States or joins a domestic terror group or attacks the Capitol on January 6th. That these are people who are young men who are isolated from society, who are obsessed with violent video games, and in particular have grievances against women. I want to hear from you, Kathleen, about to what degree misogyny or toxic masculinity is one of the pressing national security threats against our country.
I think it is a critical intersection that has to be better understood in order to fully appreciate things like the interaction between international relations, international security, and domestic politics and domestic security. In analyzing these movements, a lot of the times they're just, for coding reasons, categorized as alt-right, and the misogyny piece sort of gets put by the wayside. It doesn't quite factor into the analysis the way it really ought to. But if our senior leaders are tasked with securing our nation and a better appreciation for those dynamics, and again, like the Biden administration at the White House does seem to be quite attenuated to that, looking at some of their statements and the task forces on online misogyny, those sorts of things. These are important steps. But what needs to happen is these kinds of analyses need to become integrated into the bloodstream of our national security institutions in order to really make the difference. What do I mean by that? Women, peace, and security. Powerful set of tools. Very important work about, having women in these decision spaces. It has to be parts of the conflict resolution, so on and so forth. In national security conversations, it tends to be an add-on. It's sort of like in a speech. It's the sort of a Christmas ornament that you're hanging on a senior decision maker's like speech. That's the Christmas tree. It's not the tree itself. We need to make gender and misogyny and these kinds of analyses central to building or growing the Christmas tree, to abuse a metaphor quite thoroughly. And so senior leaders ought to be asking, okay, when we think about strategic competition, what are the gendered angles of this, right? What does, when you smash gender on this, what does it tell us? I can guarantee you're going to find something new, because that's not something that this community does at all. So to return to your question, to what extent is misogyny our major national security threat? It's a huge one, as I view it or appreciate it. And, my thinking may change as the analysis becomes, more robust. It is a amplifier. It is a intersection with other negative metastasizing conditions, right? And that it can propel it can propel violence. It can propel discrimination. There's this woman, Ashley Matthews, over at the University of North Carolina. She's incredible. And she's been doing a lot of research into the online misogyny spaces. And some of the things that are articulated by the incel, men going their own way, men's rights activists movements are horrifying. There was one video that I saw that was one of these clowns was using the theme song from Friends and like cutting, pasting like a shooter having a frenzy kind of like, your life's a joke, you're broke kind of thing. And then interspersed with images, video of the Christchurch shooting. And they did it for the laughs, the lulz. That is powerfully disturbing. And what does this tell us about these spaces where these kinds of memes are shared and appreciated and normalized? Does it mean that anybody who watches those videos is going to go to January 6th? No. But I am saying that we really ought to do a better job of appreciating the intersections.
The incel is involuntarily celibate, and I'm not going to be diplomatic. These people are freaks. They are outcasts, and it is extremely misogynistic. They take their inability to fit into society, and they, in a lot of ways, take it out on women, I think, in their ideology.
Another component of this is the men's rights activist movement, right? And and the themes that group articulates are this sense of disempowerment because women are becoming more powerful, and it's displacement theory, right? And so men need to be able to counter the gender imbalances because men are being discriminated against. And one of the memes they use is take the red pill. It's obviously the Matrix reference, but the idea is you take the red pill and then you will start to see all of the ways in which men are being disadvantaged as society evolves. Elon Musk tweeted a catcall to the men's rights activist movement. And we wonder why women are afraid of for their online safety if he takes over Twitter. It's a no-brainer if you've been paying attention. And it's not just, oh, a woman's getting doxxed or harassed or whatever. It's just online. No, these women often have to move their houses. They get death threats. This is real world impacting stuff that we're not paying attention to sufficiently in the national security spaces. We're missing a big part of the discourse.
I wonder even, Kathleen, if we're missing the most important part of the discourse, because it's interesting. We're talking about how this anti-woman grievance is perhaps one factor among many that drives people to violence, terrorist behavior. And it's interesting that some of the factors that we've previously observed or discussed as being the most important ones have been revealed to be a little bit less important than we thought. Certainly, we often hear about how recruits or sympathizers to terrorist groups come from disadvantaged socioeconomic backgrounds. But we've actually found that that's often very much not the case. Not only are financiers of international terrorism often very wealthy, from some of the most wealthy cities in the world, including the one that I used to live in. But also, we can look at the profile of the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th and see that many of them were actually quite wealthy. There were even people who flew on private jets. Another factor that's often been discussed as being the most important one is someone's religious background. But we can see that the right-wing terrorists in Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and the right-wing terrorists that we have here in the United States often do not share the same religious background at all. And it seems as though more and more, the common factor across all of these different behaviors is this sense of grievance against women. It's the thing that we can say seems to be the common denominator in many of these groups and events.
Yes. 100% yes. And we ignore that at our peril. It's time to change that. And one of the reasons I'm so delighted to be having this conversation with you is because having these conversations is how this changes.
We have January 6th spurred on by the president, who has said a lot of awful things. We have hardcore conservatives in the House Freedom Caucus who are openly sexist. We have conservative members of Congress like Tom Cotton, Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, and others who are working adamantly to prevent women from signing up for the Selective Service. So considering this, how do we not make this a partisan issue? And once it's a partisan issue, then progress is going to be much more difficult.
In my view, and I think there's a variety of different opinions on this, less inputs, more outcomes, right? Let's talk about effectiveness. Let's talk about military effectiveness. Let's talk about effectiveness when it comes to strategic competition. Let's talk about, can we be effective in this space? If we don't have the best people, regardless of their gender, race, economic background, can we do this without that talent at the table? How do we design the best strategies? How do we make the government more effective? How do we make the government better serve its people? And effectiveness is bipartisan. And again, it's another reason why this sort of like 2.0, moving us beyond representation and getting us into effectiveness, outcomes, and diversity, equity, and inclusion actually gets us in these decision-making spaces. That's the critical analytic next step that we as a community need to take. And, frankly, I'm just so excited to be at CSIS. I mean, CSIS was established in 1962. It's known as one of the small C conservative institutions in the Washington, D.C. national security landscape or intellectual landscape. And when you have an institution like CSIS saying, yes, this is important because the security of our nation and our alliances depends on getting this right, that's exciting stuff.
That concludes today's conversation. Again, huge thanks to Dr. Kathleen McInnis, Director of the Smart Women, Smart Power Initiative at CSIS. For more information and past episodes, please visit our website, pm101.live. Please also take a second to subscribe on whichever streaming service you're using right now so you don't miss our next episode. This has been Politics and Media 101. Wherever you are in the world, thank you for being a part of this community. I'm Jeff Browning. On behalf of our co-founders, Justin Higgins and John Gunnison, we hope to hear from you soon.